First of all, I want to thank our volunteers. We've got Ron and Shirley and Brenda and Janice. Let's give them a hand for helping out. If you're not a member of the Friends of the Lee County Library, there's an envelope on your table. Please consider joining our group. It's just $10 a year. That's the minimum, and you can send us as much money as you want, huh, Philip? Many zeros as you want to put on that check. That'd be great. I did want to take a couple minutes and share with you who we've got coming up later this year. In April 24th, our next lunching with books, we have, I'm going to have to get my glasses out, y'all. Joed Morris, he has 4 novels that are sequels that he'll be talking about April 24th. The first is The Land Where Our Fathers Died. That received the 2002 Mississippi Library Association Best Novel. The second one is Inherit the Land, the third is The Will, and the fourth is The Prison, which also won the Library Association Best Novel in 2019. So he's going to review all 4 of those April 24th. That'll be April. Then in May, that's May 22nd, I'll be presenting Playing for Overtime, the David Lee Herbert story. It's a story about a Class 1A football team in Tishomingo County, and they made national news back in the 80s, and I'll tell you the story. And it's really a story about not only the coach, but also what it's like to play 1A football when you don't even have enough players to to practice both sides. And but anyway, it's a great inspirational story about a man who went through tremendous tragedy, but overcame all of that. That'll be May 22nd. And then June 26th, I hope we have a full house to welcome, Marshall Ramsey. He'll be with us, and he'll be introduced by Steve Holland. And if you've seen any of the cartoons that Marshall Ramsey did about Holland, that's enough for a 2 or 3 hour, presentation. But that should be great. I keep thinking about the one he did on Billy McCoy and Steve Holland on the packing plant when they were driving down the trace and came up with that idea. Really, really funny stuff. So he ought to be really, really good. So that'll be June 26th, Marshall Ramsey. Let's see what else I have. Y'all welcome Laurie Jones from Reed's Bookstore. Let's give her a hand. She was good enough to join us. We have some of Philip's books available, and she's the manager of the bookstore and does a great job. She works with us as far as lunching with books, and she does a great job for us, and we appreciate you, Laurie. Let's see. Let's get on to the introduction here. Let me find my notes. Philip Shackelford, of course, is our director here at the Lee County Lee-Itawamba Library System. Prior to his role, he served for 7 years as the library director at the Mahoney Family Library in South Arkansas College. He was a past president of the Arkansas Library Association, served as an associate editor for the Arkansas Libraries Journal, and in 2019 was selected to the American Library Association Emerging Leaders Program. As a military historian, Philip is the author of Rise of the Mavericks, which he'll be talking about today, bringing a unique focus on organizational culture and development to the history of communication intelligence, national security, and the U.S. Air Force. Philip has presented his research during numerous annual meetings of the Society of Military History, various meetings of the Society of Intelligence History, and also delivered guest lecturers at the U.S. Air Force Air Command and Staff College and the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. Ooh. Philip, why do you have time to eat? In his spare time, here we go, we're going to find out. In his spare time, He's the creator and host of the Modern Scholar podcast, a weekly show featuring interviews with scholars, librarians, and community leaders about the profession and the work they do. If you will, please help me welcome Philip Shackelford.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you all for being here and for allowing me to come and visit with you all today. I appreciate it very much. It's an honor to be part of the Lunching with Books tradition, such a wonderful event and obviously wonderful supporters. So thank you very much for having me here today. I appreciate that. What I would like to do, I think history to me is often best told through the experiences of individuals who experienced it firsthand, right? Those of us who were present at the time of its creation. And I think especially with a story like this, that the history was obscured for so very long. And so what I would like to do is open with a story that appears in the book about a young American airman, we'll call him Tom, who arriving in London on New Year's Eve, 1953, had little idea that he would soon be engaged in one of the most secret missions of the Cold War. The streets of London were foreign and unfamiliar, filled with people who, of course, spoke English, but were somehow still difficult for Tom and his fellow American airmen to understand. The taxi to the train station was an adventure in and of itself. Tom was almost certain that the cabbie made a small fortune from the 7 American airmen that crowded into the car, as yet unaccustomed to the British money they had been given and the current rate of exchange. Then began the journey by rail to Edinburgh, Scotland, all through the night and into the wee hours of the morning. And then finally, a bus ride to the base that would be Tom's home for the next 2.5 years. It was cold. Taking in the dilapidated World War II era barracks upon arrival in the middle of the night was a stark and unwelcome wake-up call. This small, snowy base in southern Scotland was a far cry from the rural North Mississippi farm where Tom had been raised. RAF Kirk Newton, which was a small air base in southern Scotland, had been used by the Royal Air Force as an anti-aircraft station during World War II, as well as a temporary holding facility for German prisoners of war who were being transferred to the United States. Then leased by the U.S. Air Force after the war, the base was now home to a radio squadron of the U.S. Air Force Security Service. The runways filled not with planes, but with antennae, designed to collect encrypted Morse radio signals emanating from the nearby Soviet Union. Rural countryside surrounded the Kirk Newton installation, wide fields, ancient stone walls, and grazing land for Scottish sheep, a quiet expanse that stretched southward beneath the watchful gaze of Edinburgh Castle, several miles to the northeast. But during the dead of winter and covered in snow, the landscape harbored an almost unforgiving, kind of desolate character as the airmen took round-the-clock shifts in the communications compound with their radios and their teletype machines, this sort of vivid representation of the Cold War these young Americans had traveled so far to wage. Now, a little bit of a surprise, and as some of you may have guessed by now, especially if you've been looking at the captions on some of the photographs, Tom Shackelford, is my grandfather. His stories kind of represent the starting point for the entry point for me kind of getting familiar with this topic, these brief little anecdotes that he would share with my brother and I as we were growing up just up the road in Tippah County. Obviously, he never shared anything that would have indicated just how secretive an organization the Security Service really was. Certainly, to a couple of kids, it did not yet have the context for everything that he was talking about. But the journey continued for me in undergrad. During my senior year of high school, we moved with my dad's job to Northeast Ohio, and I started a history major at Kent State University. And as you're going through that process, the sophomore, junior year, you start looking ahead to the senior seminar, right? It's this major capstone project you've got at the end. And you're going to do a 30-page paper, right, and you've got to come up with a topic that you're going to write about. And so I thought, well, let me take a look at the Security Service. I know a little bit about it. It's interesting. Let me see what can be found. And I was immediately surprised and sort of flabbergasted at just how little information was out there. Of course, come to find out, there's a really good reason for that. The Security Service was an intelligence agency, obviously very secretive, and much to this day remains classified. But I started poking around doing a little bit of research, and I mentioned it to a professor I was working with in a different department as a research assistant, and we started poking around doing a little bit of research. And never will forget, we're in his lab one day, and he just looks up and just very bluntly, he says, "Your grandfather was a spy." And even if you've started to get an indication of where the research might take you or what some of these things might actually mean, to have someone put it to you that way in so many words, it makes an impression. Come to find out years later, the fact that my grandfather even ended up in the Air Force in the first place was almost an accident. When he graduated high school in spring of 1952, he had little idea for what he wanted to do for the future, but he saw the military as a way to fund his post-secondary education. And so he traveled to the nearest military recruiting station, which was over 30 miles away without telling anyone, with the intention of signing up for the U.S. Marines. But for whatever reason, when he got to the office, the Marine Corps recruiter was not there that day. And so he signed up for the Air Force as a second choice. So hopefully all of that can kind of serve as a fascinating story, right, as a hook to kind of set us up to explore what exactly was the security service and why characterize its personnel as Mavericks. It all goes back to this. In 1945, General George C. McDonald, who's then serving as Director of Intelligence for the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, writes a memo where he says, "It seems to me that when a service gives away dominion over its intelligence, it has in fact given up its independence." And you have to remember, at this point in time, the Army Air Forces, the Army Air Corps before that, well back into the interwar period, had been extremely interested in pursuing service independence. In fact, only World War II itself had kind of delayed this push for greater autonomy. Add to that the fact that air leaders were never really fully satisfied with the intelligence perspectives that Air Force leaders had. And so these two ideas came to be linked. And as World War II came to a close and began transitioning into the new Cold War environment, these Air Force leaders knew what they were doing from the word go and immediately set about the task of creating an independent communications intelligence organization that would provide the kind of information that they needed, but also at the same time help the Air Force overcome its dependence on the Army. So just to give you a little bit of a broad overview, the Air Force Security Service was a communications intelligence and communications security agency created by the Air Force in 1948. Again, to gather intelligence that would provide valuable information the Air Force needed to understand, to target, and to prevail over opposing forces during the Cold War. As well as to protect the security of internal Air Force communications. This mission did fluctuate in the later years of the Cold War to include electronic intelligence, electronic warfare operations, and so ultimately this leads to the redesignation of the command as the Electronic Security Command in 1979. But as far as that Maverick reputation, again, this is a moment in time when the Air Force is on its way up, right? Kind of building on what air leaders see as the decisive demonstration of capability and value during World War II, making their case for service independence. And it would be fairly difficult and counterintuitive, I think, for an independent service to continue relying on another service for its intelligence information. And especially, again, given the fact that Air Force leaders have never really been fully satisfied with the intelligence support they received from the Army, never really felt that the Army had their Air Force best interest at heart. So the security service is a key piece of overcoming that dependence. And it's also this incredible little microcosm of the kind of fierce independence that characterizes the Air Force at large more broadly. You know, we are the Air Force. We're something different than the Army. We have a different mission and capability, something different that we offer to national defense. And so air leaders are very intent on protecting the autonomy of this new intelligence capability, making sure that it can serve Air Force needs and Air Force priorities first, if not exclusively. So between 1948 and 1960, the number of personnel assigned to the security service increased by almost 23,000, which is a force 150 times larger than the small group they start with in 1948. By the mid-1950s, the security service had established itself as a very capable communications intelligence organization and had expanded to become the largest of the military service cryptologic agencies, kind of outpacing the pre-existing and, of course, now competing Army Security Agency and Naval Security Group. And this, again, is due in large part to this keenly felt imperative to become self-reliant in matters of intelligence, which Air Force leaders really view as key to survival. So This did not always go down well with other members of the intelligence community, which kind of leads the Army and other executive branch elements to characterize those involved as Mavericks, which was a reputation that air leaders certainly did not seek, but also did not dispute. So how did it all go down? General Henry Hap Arnold, of course, is well known in military history circles. He's one of the key figures who's grossly dissatisfied with the intelligence support that the Air Force had received during World War II. And moving into the Cold War, he knows that something has to change. And just to give you all an example of kind of the dysfunction that was allowed to develop, Arnold was never officially informed of ULTRA, which of course we all now know is the famous Allied code-breaking effort kind of spearheaded by the British during World War II, but he finds out on his own through his own independent channels. And so going forward, he knows that that's not going to work. Something has to change. Richard Klockow is also a very interesting part of all of this. He's a commander of a couple of pursuit squadrons, and during the beginning of the war, we would call them fighter squadrons today. He's actually shot down over North Africa, taken prisoner, spends 2.5 years as a prisoner of war, actually in Stalag Luft 3, which is the prison camp, of course, made famous by the movie The Great Escape. In spring of 1945, he is released and transferred back to the United States, and he is supposed to receive an extended period of rest and recuperation, but receives a surprise summons to the Pentagon, which he is none too happy about. And when he gets there, he's initially given a staff job, but then eventually transferred into G2, military intelligence, and kind of given the responsibility of learning the business of communications intelligence and military cryptology, with the ultimate goal of being able to establish that kind of capability for the Air Force. And keep in mind, the Air Force is not even an independent service yet. So it's a very interesting timeline of events that kind of puts him in place to start acquiring those skills and that knowledge, then to be able to set that up and set that organization up later on. General Vandenberg, who would eventually become Vice Chief and eventually Chief of Staff of the Air Force, was another one of those who had been in close contact with communications intelligence during the war, and then in 1949 would play a key role in preserving security service autonomy. You might say, well, wait a minute, okay, we're just getting started. Why is it necessary to already preserve their autonomy? This was necessary because of ongoing and very contentious, often very contentious debates concerning the proposed consolidation of military cryptology into a single joint agency. The Navy and the Air Force had opposed each other in the military unification debates that followed the end of World War II, kind of the debate about whether we should have 3 independent services or 2. The Navy, by and large, saw very little need for an independent Air Force. But by the time it comes to proposed consolidation of communications intelligence, they find themselves in the unfamiliar position as allies, both resisting this push for centralization, but for different reasons. The Navy opposed centralization because consolidating command and control into a single joint agency would interrupt the decentralized mode of command that they viewed as critical to naval operations. And the Air Force, as we've seen, viewed it as a matter of survival. Given the importance of communications intelligence to strategic bombing, which itself was part and parcel of the Air Force's service identity at this point, remaining dependent on other agencies for intelligence information and or subordinating air intelligence assets to joint control and direction was just an untenable proposal. So ultimately, in a surprise reversal, well, certainly a surprise to the Navy, the Air Force eventually agrees to support general consolidation, but only after a compromise proposal was submitted by the Army, which allowed the individual services to retain at least some autonomous control of their communications intelligence organizations. The Air Force then promptly designates all of its communications intelligence assets as mobile units, taking advantage of a loophole in the charter and then largely escaping service sacrifices to joint control and direction that followed when the Armed Forces Security Agency was created in 1949. So this single-minded focus, right, as well as the preparation and kind of the bureaucratic navigation that made these amenable results possible is the overarching characteristic of the security services kind of rise to prominence in the post-war cryptologic community. What the Army and the executive branch saw as territorialism and defiance, air leaders understood as pursuing institutional priorities and safeguarding independence and kind of shrewdly maneuvering towards greater autonomy, like the Mavericks they were seen to be. So, in short, my book argues that the security service kind of lives up to this characterization in three specific ways. First, by building upon a long history of independent thinking and organizational struggles in relation to aviation's place within the wider military establishment. Then by taking that next step to create and develop an independent communications intelligence capability, largely free from external influence. And then third, by persistently resisting control from the Armed Forces Security Agency first, and then the National Security Agency when it's created in 1952. I also wanted to kind of situate the security service within the broader Cold War context, right, and examine connections between this command and larger developments in American military strategy and foreign policy, such as the new look, the flexible response, all of these things we know and love from the 1950s and 60s. And when we do that, an interesting trend kind of emerges, which indicates that as the relevance of strategic air power to the overall foreign policy of the United States diminishes in the waning years of the Cold War, this mirrors a diversification in the kind of missions and activities of the security service, which again, as we mentioned, leads to the ultimate redesignation of the command as the Electronic Security Command in 1979. There's also a simultaneous evolution in the attitude of the security service. It kind of becomes more joint-minded as time progresses, which reflects the observation that the command's early sort of maverick outlook was a distinctly early Cold War phenomenon, kind of expedient for the purposes of securing valuable autonomy in the command's early years, and then subsequently less relevant as the Cold War progressed. So, as you might expect, the sources that are out there support more of an organizational history as opposed to an operational history. Much remains classified. And the kinds of reports and command histories and other documentation that are available kind of serve to illustrate these large bureaucratic decisions and the rationales that supported them. I was able to conduct a few oral history interviews with surviving members of the command, and to me these serve to not only personalize the narrative, but also add layers of realism to the study of the command, day in the life aspects, what it was like to serve as a member of this organization. There's also photographs, some from the Air Force, which kind of highlight specific bases or airframes or technology, things like that, but also some from my grandfather's collection, and you've seen a few of those today in the presentation. So let me talk to you a little bit, just very briefly, about historiography, right, which is this kind of fancy word that historians use to talk about the body of literature that's kind of dedicated to a given topic. And there are bodies of literature that look at the Cold War, that look at intelligence history, military unification after World War II, the emergence of American national security, both as a concept but also as a sort of tangible apparatus that's integrated into the defense establishment, but hardly ever in the same book or in the same conversation. Despite the fact that all of these things are very closely interrelated and entangled together, I think particularly with an example like the Air Force and the Air Force Security Service. The Air Force, of course, comes of age during World War II and is very interested in pursuing service independence thereafter. And the experience of World War II has convinced pretty much everyone of the critical importance of communications intelligence and securing a reliable system that can provide that kind of information for military leaders and policymakers. But nobody can agree on how it should be set up, right? And so that's where this story really collides with the idea of military unification after the war, because essentially the same conversation is happening at a much larger scale. How should we organize American national defense? Should we have two major military services, or three, or maybe a single defense department with different military branches organized beneath it? How should that be organized? And this debate is taking place pretty much in full view of the American public, in Congress and in the newspapers. And so when the national defense establishment is finally written into law with the National Security Act of 1947, that new legislation includes an Air Force, separated from the U.S. Army, and now tasked with serving, as air leaders certainly see it, America's first line of defense in this new thing called the Cold War. And so my book tries to bring all of those disparate conversations together and show how the security service is a really interesting piece of a really, really complex puzzle. The other challenge is when it comes to both scholarly and popular literature that look at communications intelligence, both during the Cold War and beyond. The National Security Agency is sort of the elephant in the room, right? It's this massive colossus that kind of monopolizes all of the attention, which means that the other agencies, the pre-existing agencies and cooperating agencies like these military service cryptologic organizations, are often overlooked or just ignored altogether, and that's not the whole story. And I think as more and more information continues to be declassified, we'll be able to generate research like this that takes a look at these other agencies and their contributions and is able to tell a much larger part of the story. The Air Force Security Service is a command that's largely missing from the pages of history, but played such a key role and so closely entangled with all of these dramatic shifts and transformative developments that really characterize the post-World War II period in the United States, and also played a key role in shaping the early Air Force into a truly modern, capable, and strategic force. And I think that's a story that needed to be told. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to dig into those and have a discussion. And I thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Could you describe some of the training that people like your
Yep.
grandfather went through before they were actually assigned?
Yeah, I'll do my best briefly. They had a wide variety of different training depending on what their end role was going to be, right? So my grandfather was a teletype operator, and so they would have a specific school dedicated to learning how to use a teletype machine and how to make it work in the setting that he was ultimately going to be assigned in. The teletype school that he attended was in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which was his first winter outside the South, which he talks about as a very interesting experience. But that's just an example of the kind of different schools that they would have scattered around through the country at various bases where the security service training happened. A lot of those were in Texas in the San Antonio area. Of course, Lackland Air Force Base is where he did basic training, but they also had security service training there as well. So it would be more, sometimes it would be language school, and then teletype as well. Other technological specific elements to what they would be doing in the service.
I have one other question.
Yes, sir.
How much did the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor force the military to take another look at the way their system was set up?
It was a huge impact. It was a huge impact. And there's a lot, if you look at kind of the episode of Pearl Harbor, but also military intelligence leading up to the event of Pearl Harbor, how dysfunctional it was allowed to become, to the point that the Army and the Navy really didn't talk to each other, and they kind of split collection based on even in odd days of the week. It was a mess. It was a mess. And so Pearl Harbor kind of forces a conversation about what went wrong, how can we fix it, what does it need to look like going forward, and that does not get solved. It's probably still not solved today, right? There's still, we have 17 or 18, I think, intelligence agencies in the community today. So it's an ongoing matter, and I think what makes an episode like this or a command like this interesting to study today is we can take a look and say, okay, what are some of the decisions that they were making at the time? What were some of the priorities that they had related to personnel, related to mission, related to relationships with other agencies? And what wisdom or warnings does that give us for the current time? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir.
So where were these bases located?
Mm-hmm.
And how much or when did this evolve into having spy planes either listening or taking photographs from the air? How
Yeah.
did that evolve?
Great question. So the 1950s are a period of huge expansion, right, for the security service. When they start in 48, basically they're trying to get off the ground, get organized, get a small cadre of folks together to start this. And then in the 1950s, they start expanding tremendously, and so they end up with bases all around the world. Scotland was one of the northernmost bases that they had, but they ended up with bases in Alaska, Thailand, Crete, Italy, Turkey, all around the world. What makes this kind of intelligence collection interesting and also tricky at times is you have to intercept intercept signals where the signals are going to bounce off and come back down. You want to be in a good location to intercept those signals. And so that's why they would have to scatter these bases throughout the world. And often it was a very complex process because if the United States did not have a base already in that country, there were negotiations that had to be done with the State Department, basing rights, leasing rights, all of these things that had to be worked out. But the 1950s are really kind of the period of expansion for the command. Spy planes and kind of airborne collection, they began fairly on with flights, peripheral flights, what they would call peripheral flights, where they would fly around a given country or a given airspace to try to collect signals that are emanating from that country. And that's how it starts initially, kind of with encrypted Morse intercept. Also then moves to language intercept, and you start to see a lot of Russian linguists, Korean linguists, Japanese, Chinese linguists being trained up. And then when we start moving into the 1960s, it's a different program, so it's not related to the security service, but you start to see planes like the U-2 come on board, other strategies where they're doing very high photographic reconnaissance of various territories, Russia in particular. And so all of that is kind of coming together. Yes, sir.
What is the progression of orchestra leader, so to speak, where cooperation among all these intelligence agencies? We're still the United States. You got to work together.
Yeah, it was very complex, and I think especially in the early periods, in the early 1950s, was very chaotic. Nobody really wanted to work together, and especially with communications intelligence. The Army and the Navy never really, until the point where the Air Force and the Navy were kind of pulling together, didn't really see the point of adding another agency. We've already got this covered. Why do we need the Air Force to have its own independent communications intelligence? And so Korea is actually the first kind of real-world test of the security service. This is the first major conflict after World War II, and so the Army Security Agency is there, the Air Force Security Service is there, and they're constantly stepping on each other's toes. There's a lot of bad blood kind of between not only between the Army and the Navy and kind of getting back to headquarters, but also now you've got the Armed Forces Security Agency, which is created in 1949 to kind of be this umbrella organization trying to coordinate all of the operations of these different agencies. But it's not given budgetary control, and it's not given direct operational control. And so those two things kind of plague its ability to provide effective direction and oversight of those military cryptologic agencies. The same thing, they repeat that same mistake when the National Security Agency is established in '52. So it's a really interesting chain of events that the service agencies are very interested in preserving. You know, we know what we need, right? We need to be able to set our own priorities, work our own missions. And so this conversation about having kind of a national mission or a national structure added on top of that is a very, very contentious thing that continues throughout the 1950s, really. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a specific answer, but what concerns me is working together.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be some degree of that.
There's some degree of, and I think it improves the further we go along throughout the Cold War. So by the time you get to the 1960s, they're still figuring things out, but the experience of Vietnam really brings everybody together, and you start to see more cooperation not only between services, but also with the National Security Agency, realizing that, okay, yeah, the national mission is something that we need to be aware of and that we need to support. And so it gets progressively better, and I'm not going to say it's perfect, obviously. You know, we've got, like I said, 17 or 18 agencies that still probably have issues communicating. But it does continue to get progressively better as you go. Yes, sir.
Sometimes the coordination may be good among the intelligence components of the military, but they don't always make sure they've got support if they got to get in trouble.
Yep.
In 1968, in January, the North Koreans came down to Seoul to try to kill the president of South Korea. That failed. 2 days later, they took our Pueblo, a Navy ship in international waters.
Yep.
We didn't have a single aircraft in Japan or South Korea to help them.
Yep.
They kept that crew for a year. That boat, all the equipment on there, the printouts, none of that was destroyed. Lloyd Booker was the commander. He got court-martialed, I think, after he got out of prison over in North Korea. But that almost caused a war.
Yeah.
And there was no support for those guys.
Right. Yeah, it was a tricky thing, and the issue about not having aircraft in place, I mean, that's something you kind of see also straining in the early years of Vietnam, because you have the lead up to the conflict in Vietnam. They're starting to, they know something might happen. They're trying to get assets in place. But also at that same time, or a few years earlier, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so it's a constant battle with the security service of having aircraft that are pulled away, essentially, from Southeast Asia to cover the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's kind of this back and forth of where do we put our assets, who's given the orders, what priorities do we actually have. And so it's a constant back and forth.
Well, when you think about it, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Army still have a big aviation component themselves.
Yep.
So really, I guess the Air Force difference is strategic bombing and strategic control.
And that's how they made their case in those early years, right? And that's why Korea was such a shock. They really weren't prepared for a conventional conflict in that way. They were preparing for the strategic threat, the Soviet Union, war with the Soviet Union, and kind of training up their personnel base in that way. Russian linguists, no Korean linguists, right? So by the time the Korean War comes along, there's a rush. There is very chaotic to try to train up some Korean linguists so that they can actually be in place and help and do some good. Because when it first gets started, we don't have any. So it's an interesting dynamic there for sure. Yes, sir.
President Eisenhower's 2 terms in office, and of course he was, did he any influence, did he play neutral about all this commanding, or did he try to steer it where the Army would still be?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. What I've seen indicates to me that Eisenhower was very much a fan of the Air Force. He had, of course, the concept of massive retaliation that he kind of brought to foreign policy and military strategy in those early years. Yes, sir. Really kind of highlighted the strategic capabilities of the Air Force, which of course fell right in line with what the Air Force was interested in developing and the capabilities that they wanted to emphasize. So especially in the early 50s, Eisenhower and the Air Force are speaking the same language. And so it's not until we get to some of the other hot spots that begin to pop up where we say, and of course Kennedy then comes in and say, hey, we need a flexible response. We need a different way to respond to these sorts of incidents that will not immediately escalate to everything we've got. So, yes, sir.
His interest in the Air Force, was that in the Army Air Corps from World War II, or was he thinking Air Force in terms of independence?
Well, of course, the Air Force becomes independent in 1947, so a few years earlier than before he becomes president. I think part of his interest and support of the Air Force probably comes from the wartime experience and seeing how that went and really believing what the air leaders are telling him in terms of this was a decisive demonstration of what we can do. And so kind of carrying that forward, especially after the Soviet Union successfully tested a nuclear weapon, it was at 49, really then believing that the Air Force is the one that's going to be able to put a strategic nuclear weapon over the Soviet Union if we need to do that. And so I think that's where a lot of the initial investment and priority comes from, especially in the early 1950s. Yeah. What else? This is great. Yes, ma'am.
Not a war question. But tell everyone, what is she going to ask? Not smart enough to ask. Tell me again the name of your podcast and just a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure. So it's called the Modern Scholar Podcast. It's a weekly show. Basically came out of the idea that there are conversations I think that needed to be highlighted, specifically regarding the 2 professions that I'm a part of, right? Libraries and history. These are 2 professions where there's a lot of great work that's being done, but also a fair amount of challenges that kind of exist on the professional landscape. And so as a way to talk about those, and also for those who are maybe in grad school and kind of considering careers in either one of these or various different academic professions or whatever the case may be, to talk about some of the things that don't really get talked about in the academic program. For me, that's a skills-based conversation. I think there's a lot of skills that we, quote-unquote, need as modern scholars, right, beyond the content. And a lot of academic programs, history, I'll give you just from my personal experience, is very heavily based in content, as it should be, right? But I think also there needs to be an additional conversation about skills, about public speaking, social media, web design, statistical analysis, all of these things that we now recognize that we need as modern scholars, being able to talk about our research and kind of engage a wider audience for the work that we do. But those conversations don't really happen in your traditional academic programs. And so this was just a way to kind of bring a variety of different professionals together, librarians, scholars, community leaders across different organizations, nonprofits are a great way to talk about this. What are some of the skills that they see that they use on a daily basis that either they weren't prepared for or that they had to develop somewhere along the way, and how can we have that conversation and start to prepare folks earlier in the pipeline for the skills and the things that they'll need to be able to do when they continue. And so it's a great way. Of course, history, libraries, these are both professions where a lot of great work is being done, and so it's an opportunity to talk about interesting research and interesting developments that are going out throughout library land. So it's a fun time. It's a fun time. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I got one question about the breakdown of the strategic part. We have what we call the nuclear triad, boomers, the submarines, or the nuclear missiles. And you have the strategic air command, whatever they're using, B-52s or B-2s or B-21s or whatever. And then you have the ICBM based in the United States. The Army is left out totally in strategic deterrence. Is that for a reason because the Army doesn't have any Air Force or any aircraft or I remember back in the 50s, if I remember correctly, they did have some long-range artillery with nuclear weapons.
Right.
They were based in Europe. The height of the Cold War, but they're totally out of the picture nuclear-wise, aren't they?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Army, so let me just say that first. But what I will say is I think you're right. I think that was probably a gap in the coverage. And some of the research that I've seen talks about how in the late 1950s in particular, the Army almost goes through a little bit of an identity crisis in terms of what exactly is our mission, what are we contributing, and kind of having to figure that out. Because again, the emphasis, especially in the early 1950s, is on that strategic question. And the Air Force is right there answering, we've got it, this is what we do. And so that's when, from transition from the late 1950s into the 1960s, you start to see, of course, Kennedy comes in with the flexible response. We want to think about this different way, counterinsurgency, right? All of those different things that start to get added into the conversation about how infantry and conventional forces in the Army is going to play an important role. And then, of course, we see Vietnam come along, and a lot of those things get put into practice. So that's my short answer. Again, I'm not an expert on the Army, but that's what I would say.
On a side note, Eisenhower and Kennedy were not too happy about the CIA.
Yeah, big surprise there. Nobody's really happy about the CIA. Nobody's really happy about the CIA. I've read enough to say that whatever you've heard about the CIA, whatever stories are floating around out there, believe it. Believe it. They're true. What else? Well, thank y'all so much. I'm going to be over here in case anybody wants to stop by. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Again, we have books for sale over here. I'm about 3/4 through with that book. It's an excellent read.
Thank you.
Join us April 24th for Joey Morris's presentation. Thank y'all.